let's get going, which is Susie and Arianna, if you can just give maybe 30 seconds background as to your professional experience and experiences. I can obviously do the same as well. But the great thing, I think, in this chat is we've got lawyers and players' perspectives from across the men's and the women's game. And that's what I'm probably most excited to hear about. Susie, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. So I'm a shareholder with Plaster Greenberg. I'm based out of Philadelphia, New York. I'm a shareholder in the Labor and Employment Group, so I counsel companies and executives on employment issues. I counsel companies on their policies and procedures, and I also draft executive contracts, which I think we'll talk about today. And that's kind of my gist.
Awesome. My name is Arianna Criscione. I am an ex-professional football player. I was lucky enough to play for almost 15 years professionally throughout Europe in 5 different countries. I also enjoyed getting lots of educational diplomas and accolades during my football career, because who wants to just play football at the same time? And so I also got a master's degree in the business of football. I focus on women's football especially, but I enjoy talking about all aspects of the game and a whole lot of other fun stuff that people can look up online, and I don't really need to tell them like this.
No nonsense. No nonsense.
That's right.
Can I, Arianna, ask one thing before we start as well? How did you get the Camavinga shirt?
You can totally ask. We have a lot of shirts, but Camavinga played for my husband, and so Cama gave it to him like when he comes back to Rennes to visit. And so there's quite a few guys up here and around, and my husband regularly changes the shirts behind him for the players that give him presents on a regular basis.
So you always keep your jersey up?
I'm not gonna lie, when I do podcasts, I usually put my jersey up just, to make sure that people know, but the colors and the players change regularly behind me.
I just have my backpack and ski jacket from the winter.
Well, mine's worse. It looks like I'm in a call center, so I think, some
I usually do win the background award, though.
Correct. Well, look, let's get going. We've probably got 4 or 5 topics to crack on with and discuss. And one of the topics that we thought might be useful to start with is generally agents in football as well. And that's probably one of my sweet spots, simply because most of my clients are agents, and then obviously the players that they represent too for the types of work that I do. Arianna, if I just turn to you first and say, agents, what's your view on them, as a very open-ended question, and then maybe I can go back on that. In your career, bearing in mind obviously now that the women's game is supercharging itself right now, where do you see agents' roles on the female side? Obviously there's commercial and on pitch, but you can take it in whichever direction you want.
Yeah, I think the agent question is quite a bit complicated, because I also think with the visibility and the money coming into the women's game, you have more people wanting to become agents in the women's game, or trying to kind of tack this on to their current business model, not really knowing what's going on in the women's game, who these players are, what they can offer and why, which is not necessarily the best combination. I did have an agent at parts of my career. When I played at PSG, I actually did my whole contract by myself. So that was different. I know agents are making a huge deal for the good and the bad of the women's game right now. And I do have mixed feelings about it. And obviously, FIFA's come out with an agent exam. And how does this relate to women's football? And how can we make sure the right agents are getting into women's football? I don't have an answer to that. I don't like, though, that in my personal opinion, the concept of agent is to make money for themselves too. And sometimes there's positives that they're trying to get their players the highest amount of money so that they get money. But sometimes they're also putting players at clubs or at places that benefit themselves, and maybe not necessarily the growth of the player's career or what's best for the player. And again, I don't know how to solve that problem, but in the women's game, it's a little more complicated, because where the money is and where it's going makes it more interesting. And I might be just talking in circles, and it's not as easy for people to understand, but the men's game is more defined, and you can go on Transfer Market, or you can understand what the value of these players are more easily. And for the women's game, we don't know. Like we've seen some crazy numbers, amazing numbers that are really helping the game, but we really don't know what average salaries are, or we know median salaries in the league because they take the highest and they take the lowest, and you can take an average or you can take a median, but what does that really mean for the normal 80% of the league players? I don't know, and I read a lot of stuff, so I don't know how the agents know either. It's very complicated.
I have a question for you, Daniel. How do you agents, many agents are not lawyers. Some agents are lawyers. How do you counsel, because I believe education for agents to understand the terms of a contract, the parts of a contract, like knowledge gives these agents power to help the players, to advocate for the players. And Arianna, I hear you on the inherent conflict that is with an agent and a player. It's almost like an attorney, though, litigating a case. Do you want to settle the case or do you want to keep going? But Daniel, how do you get to the agents to know when they don't know? You know, when an agent can say, you know what, I need a lawyer for this, or you know what, I have a question.
Yeah, exactly right. It usually comes in the reactive moments when there's a problem. It's always that. Some of my greatest achievements, I think, technically and personally, have come where you've had to really deal with difficult problem scenarios, not the, great deals where you're involved with a record-breaking deal and everything's gone relatively smoothly. It's sometimes the smaller things and all the rest of it. So you're exactly right. The issue is you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of the time I'm having to speak with a lot of my clients around educating them about what an indemnity clause is, or why a termination is important, or what a warranty is. And really nobody cares, and that's okay. That's all right too. But it's really for those very small sets of circumstances where something goes wrong and then suddenly everybody is looking to see the drafting of that particular clause and whether it's been done as well as it could have been. So the short answer is education. The longer answer is agents that unfortunately have been in the industry longer and have seen things go wrong are then more understanding of why this is necessary. It's sometimes the more risk, the agents that are willing to take more risk, perhaps sometimes are a little bit younger and don't have that same level of experience. Because in the end, everyone's just happy that the deal's been done or about to be done. And then the sort of time pressures and the risk factors and everything else comes along. So it's all of that in the round, I think.
Either one of you could answer this, but I think it's something really important, and it's important to me, is giving players back the power, and that's a weird way to say it, but them understanding more about what they're signing and looking into it. So you said 3 words that players might not know or understand. So it was indemnity, warranty, and there was a third. I think explaining those, and termination, I can assume. From a lawyer perspective, either one of you can jump in, but if you could give a quick understanding so that the players might know what that means, I think it could be really beneficial.
Really funny you say that. So I do more work outside of the football world, soccer world, but dealing with an executive is the same as dealing with a player, because you walk them through the contract of what this actually means. And Daniel and I have talked offline about how they're pretty similar. I know there's football specific. Listen to me saying football. I know there's football specific terms, but it really is applicable across industries. It's all the same: termination, indemnity, defense, arbitration clauses, choice of law, venue, what's going to happen if there's a breach. And I think if it takes Daniel, to your point, whenever there's a foul up in the last one, if there's a litigation or there's a conflict with one contract, you learn from the next. That's why they call it the practice of law. You learn and you apply it to the next client that comes along, because you don't want that to happen again. So the seemingly miscellaneous terms that players, executives, nobody reads them, matter a great deal. So it's the lawyer's job, I would say, this is where we really do the work, is to captivate our audience, which is the executive or the player or the agent that doesn't want to listen, to say, let's talk about it. Let's walk through the contract. And Arianna, and so I know I'm talking like in an ideal world, all players will sit down and I'm going to teach them indemnity and defense. But do you see that as a realistic proposition? I think I know your answer.
I mean, I have to be honest. I never signed a contract that I didn't read every word. I might not have understood every word, and I know that
You're rare.
Not be the general population, but I learned at a young age that you don't put your name on something until you read it. And I like to ask a lot of questions. And I think this is something that we can teach the new generation of players. And I think it comes down to educating players on what you can be educated about. Like, and the change that's now coming, and it was a podcast I also listened to earlier, talking about the NWSL. There was a lot of generations of players that were told, be happy you get to play. Don't question your employer. Don't look at yourself as an employee. Just be happy that you're even getting a paycheck or that you can live playing your sport. And that is changing quite a bit today. And with that change, and you and I have talked about this, Susie, a lot, comes the responsibility of the players understanding their rights and knowing it. And so are 99% of them probably going to read that contract and ask you to define each word? No. But if we can start to get them to look at it or start to get them to understand some of these words, then they go back to the locker room and they're like, oh my God, did you guys know that in our contracts it says blah, 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 or what this term actually means? Or, you know, I did just get screwed on this. Don't let them put it in your contract like that.
Yes.
This is where those conversations come up. And so again, I think understanding like what does indemnity mean? Like how does that affect me is an important question. And like, so those 3 questions I would love just like a very brief as it could be. What does it mean for me as the player? And how can I make sure to know what my rights are with that?
I'll let Daniel answer the indemnity, but I will add something to you because, you know, I'm more of the employer side, the management side, maybe the club or the league side, Arianna. In my practice, players need to see themselves as executives, and they need to see these documents not as a sign-up sheet to play rec soccer. This is them providing a service, their service, their skill set to an employer, to a league, to a team. So I think and in the US, it's kind of crazy amazing that what they're doing here with the ethos of the US, you know, employment laws of equal pay, of autonomy, of transparency. It's super fun to see these players. I think a lot of them do see themselves as executives. Not all of them, Arianna, but I think the older ones might. I don't know.
I think the older ones who have power and know who they are in the industry and know that their voice can make a difference, they do. But I think for the average player, or, you know, 1 through 9 on the roster, not like the other jersey numbers 1 through 9, but the top 9 players or even your top 11 have one kind of power, and 11 through 25 or 11 through 30 is completely different. And they are still, some of them, in, I'm really happy I just get to keep playing the sport that I love.
You know what? And we'll let Daniel explain indemnity, but it's the same in law. When you see new graduates come in, they're just happy to be at a law firm. They don't negotiate. Yeah, Daniel, you know what it's like. They're just so happy to be in a law firm. They don't spend the time to market themselves and build their book of business. So then they just become happy to have a job, happy to be in a law firm. And then over time, you do start to promote yourself, to market yourself, and you see that the more you have. So hopefully, if you change now, I have to cut you off though, that I don't know 11 through 25 always get that opportunity to stay on the team long enough to build that, like your career. Right, point taken.
It's only 1 or 2 years. And so maybe had you built that confidence, you would have been a better player on the field. So there's a slight difference.
That's where the management side, that's where the club and the league can create a culture that does support these players. So that's where both 100%. Sides work together. Okay, Daniel, what's indemnity?
Okay, let's go back to Law School 101. Well, whenever I see the word indemnity, it strikes fear into me because of, unfortunately, all of the various cases that I've had to deal with. So very briefly, Arianna, what the reason why indemnities come up in playing contracts and in agents contracts is usually when one party does something wrong and the other party can sue. Now, what an indemnity does is actually go even further than that. That says if an event happens, a particular event happens, then the party that has suffered loss can sue that party for a lot. And the reason why an indemnity is more significant than any other clause is because it's a defined, not necessarily amount, but a defined set of circumstances that you can be sued for. And it's effectively, or what I like to call and explain it, a promise to pay. So in the event that this happens, I promise to pay you all your costs, all of your losses, all of what might be indirect and consequential loss, all of your reasonable legal fees, everything that goes along with it. And so the reason why that strikes fear into me when I'm representing a player is because the player usually has unlimited liability. It's not like you're even acting for a company, and therefore it might not be that the player even has the money to be able to do that in a particular instance. And granted, those circumstances where a player might be sued or an agent might be sued by their club might be very, very small and minimal. For the 0.0001% time that it happens, it's extremely significant. So indemnity is always try and educate. Termination is another one, which is when can a club effectively stop the employment contract. That's what we're saying, and we want to obviously minimize those possibilities at all times. Now, if you remember correctly, a couple of years ago, the WSL changed their standard terms, whereby I believe that it was actually 3 to 6 months that a player, if they were injured, their employment contract could simply be terminated, regardless of whether they had a 5-year deal or whether they had a 1-year deal. Now, obviously, that's been collectively bargained and increased, and there's still controversy around that because of the sustainability of the league, etc., etc. But we had a number of situations where clubs were looking to try and sign the players up to the old contracts before the new ones came in, which obviously they may have been doing it innocently, but we were just saying, well, holding fire, because you've got greater rights if you just hold on another 2 months. So all of those type of things come into the mix.
And so with indemnity, though, is that actually clearly written out, or is it a very broad thing that you're not really sure? So, for example,
the problem is it's broad, yes, so it covers so much. Yeah,
it's a really boring paragraph that no one wants to read. That's also the problem. So Daniel could be the most enticing lawyer or solicitor or barrister, whatever we call them over there, in the world. But if he's explaining indemnity, my eyes will glaze over. It's not. So that's where he earns his money. And I think, to your point about termination, Daniel, and the old contract in the WSL, that all came from explaining the clause to a player. And I'm sure, like, once, if you look through the termination, even of an executive, there's 4 cause, there's, change of control in the company and stuff like that. If you have one player, and it's probably you, Arianna, that listened and that saw it and asked a question, that's where the change happens, because employers will do whatever they do to get away with it. I mean, what's best for the bottom line.
So now I'm gonna throw this rocket at you guys that I said earlier that you guys have no ideas coming, and it crosses over to a lot of stuff, and it will go into what we're going to talk about before. But talking about the employer, we can all agree that the club or the league is the employer, depending on where you play. But now we have more in the women's game, that your sponsors might actually be paying you more money than your employer. And how do these rights start to come in when your sponsor wants you to do an event and the club owns your rights? Do you think that in the women's game, this could start to change if those salaries don't go up high enough and the sponsorship rights continue with the bigger brands? Or how could this make a difference? And could players start writing it in their contracts? Yes, you're my employer, but if such and such brand calls me out for a day event, they're paying me 5 times as much as you pay. That's actually how I earn my bread and butter. Who has the rights to what I'm actually doing, and where is this going?
I think that's a business decision for the player. When you have two contracts, let's say you have the standard player contract with a league or a club, and then you have an agreement with a company that's sponsoring you, you need to see if your actions are going to be in breach of the other. And I would argue, like when I'm counseling a company on a practice, and Daniel, I don't know how you do it, but I'm sure you just counsel on the exposure to risk. Like, if you act this way, then here's the risk. Will the league, ping you for missing a day of practice? I mean, I'm from Philadelphia, so we have Allen Iverson, we're talking about practice. He doesn't even go to it. So you could be that player that sits out of practice to go do a photo shoot somewhere with a car. And and then on the league decision, like, usually I come in when a company is saying, we have this employee who just breached their contract. And then we say, I would go down the decision tree of, okay, did they breach? Yes. Okay. Was it a car commercial that is going to promote the league, and you're going to ping this player for promoting herself? I don't know if that's the best PR. So usually, Arianna, there's a term in a contract that says waiver of failure to enforce one term of the contract does not mean that it's invalid for the rest of the period. In other words, this player breached once, right? Okay, if the league lets her slide, let's say, okay, car commercial was wonderful. You promote the league, you promoted yourself, great. But that doesn't mean that your contract still doesn't apply. So if you do this next month and you miss a game for it, and you're saying I'm not paid enough, I should play, we can take you to arbitration or whatever the terms are when you breached. So that's actually a term of the contract that's really boring that no one talks about, but it's important to keep. At least in the U.S. contracts, we say like if you don't failure to discipline once does not invalidate this contract for the term. Daniel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest issues. I can only speak from my experience of working with WSL players, in that for a lot of players, they are earning more off pitch than on pitch, and that's the anomaly. For all of my years working with the male footballers, it's never been that, apart from a few that are earning incredible amounts, but they're outliers of outliers in any event. My view generally is that it's all to do with NIL and image rights agreements, and we can talk about that in due course as well. And then, which goes to your point, Arianna, it's the question about what rights do the club have for the player in a club context? What rights does the sponsor have, usually in an individual context, and where that overlap happens? And let's not forget also, there are international obligations on particular players, and those players might not want their images associated with particular club brands, never mind international brands that they might not even have any even indirect contractual relationship with. So all of that in the round means effectively, I completely agree with Susie's perspective, which is risk. Would I advise my clients to do anything silly, like avoid or miss training in order to do a commercial? No is the answer, because there can be quite significant disciplinary outcomes as a result. Usually the issue comes when a player enters into a commercial deal where they might not be allowed to, because that company is a competitor of a club partner. That usually tends to be the issue that comes to mind after the boot deals, of course. So where there will be greater room for problems, I think, in the next few years, is where players aren't being paid brilliant money still. And let's get this right, it's only really, we're talking about the top 5% of the WSL that are being paid anywhere near decent money still. I'm sorry, I'm maybe being a bit arbitrary with that number, but let's just say 5 to 10%. Then after that, everyone else is looking for even quite small incremental commercial deals to supplement income. And that's where possibly, as things become more commercial and the broadcast rights become bigger and there's greater visibility and there's more room for problems, that seems to be where I think things might be headed.
And I think this even gets more interesting when you look at, obviously, the most recent disagreement that the players had with the FA, where the FA said they weren't allowed to do any commercial deals with their sponsors a couple weeks before the Women's World Cup started, which actually hurt quite a few players financially. And they ended up all having this very short deadline of getting all their sponsors on their social media in one day. And it was just kind of this hodgepodge and like oversaturation of the market of all of these things. So my question to you guys then too is, your employer is your club or league, as we've already established, but what does the national team come in? Do those rights change to the national federations? Do they become your employer during international breaks? Or does it stay with the rights of your club? And, if your club is giving you the permission, or let's say one of your sponsors is the same brand as the club, so your club very much wants you to keep them happy and do an event.
Yeah. I was going to say, I don't know enough about the intricacies of a league's relationship with the federation. I will say, though, that it is clear that these players are, at least in the U.S., as we saw with their lawsuit against U.S. soccer, they are employees of U.S. soccer as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to bring such a cause of action for equal pay. I don't know the intricacies of it, though, so I can't really speak to it.
Well, Arianna, the interesting thing there is that the Lionesses, for example, are not employees of the Football Association. That's the interesting thing, Susie, that's great from speaking to all of us together, which is it's so different in different jurisdictions, which is great and very interesting in itself. And that's the whole reason why there's, I guess, the different types of collective bargaining agreements that are in place that aren't in place in the UK, for example. But you're exactly right. My takeaway from that debacle, Arianna, on the Lionesses side is um, communications just needs to be a lot better. And I think that's where maybe the certain structures in the women's game are still playing catch up. They're playing catch up because there are suddenly such big commercial opportunities, and that people are being perhaps maybe more reactive rather than proactive. Because you can imagine, let's just take, for example, a lioness who has a Puma deal, and Puma spent £100,000 on activating that Puma deal in the month leading up before the World Cup, and then the FA says, "Oh, by the way, no one can post or publish or do anything in the blackout period that we have in advance." I mean, if I was Puma, not only would I be annoyed, but I would probably be suing the FA unless
I'd sue
they,
them.
unless they, decided otherwise. And this isn't me saying sue the FA and sue these guys and sue everybody. This is more.
Whoa, guys.
No, but
This is
sometimes
more,
that's what it takes
yeah,
to enforce.
it's
Actually,
leverage. Yeah,
it's actually also it's interfering with their business relationship with this player. And there's probably, I'm sure you could calculate damages as a result of that decision, Arianna. And that's where I'd sue for, if I were Puma. I'm not saying, I mean, also from the States, so we're litigious over here.
Yeah, but so my argument though, again though, for these players though, is what is the risk of you not being called back to the national team though for the next event if you created that
I completely agree.
one thing? Because looking at US and them going to US soccer, it was the top players who had a little bit more of leeway or even a cushion, and they'd already won World Cups, and if their career ended that day with the national team, I'm sure they would be super sad, but there were certain players making certain decisions. For some of the Lionesses, it might be their first time being called up, or their first opportunity to really be an impact player. And there's a lot of other players in England that are fantastic, and it could be easy for the FA to make changes at the next tournament or event that would complicate for these players. So I think that's a really big issue. And I think also I'm still really to try to understand though, how can they sign CBAs with the FA if the FA is not a type of employer? Like, how does that legally come down to it? And also, how do you go into major tournaments without having a CBA? Currently, the Lionesses do not have an agreement. They've been fighting for it since the Euros. They obviously wrote something right before the tournament started and then said, okay, we're going to put this to the side because we're going to focus on actually winning this, and then we'll deal with it. But, how does that affect the players, and what are their rights there?
Arianna, they need a good lawyer.
They need a good lawyer. They need.
Yeah. So, well, no, look, the short answer is when a tournament is looming, and you, again, will know it better than I, when sporting perspectives become the overriding concern, then everything else gets put to the side. And that is exactly what the players, I think, very sensibly have done, is you don't want this looming over and going into games and then it being worrying about selection. Who's the person that's saying we need to look after our rights now when you're going into tournament? It is in the 3 or 4 months after the tournament is finished that everyone or the relevant representatives will sit down and try and put in place out of thought a 3 to 4 year plan as to what needs to be done. Now, in my experience in the past, not keeping on going with the Lionesses, but there are equivalent of NIL agreements that certain Lionesses will sign, or other players at different associations will sign, where that national association can use their NIL or image rights for particular purposes. But that doesn't necessarily go as far or as nuanced as, but you can't post within this particular time or this particular period. That was imposed by the reporting that it was seen. So all of these things are trying to play catch up, and it's great to have this type of conversation because, it's not, it obviously was a very inefficient, inopportune moment in advance of, the pinnacle of most players' careers, which is the World Cup.
Absolutely. And I think go ahead, Susie.
Oh no, I was going to say, as it relates to the U.S. side, it started in '96 with when the top, to your point, Arianna, the top players boycotted. They sat out for the Atlanta Olympics when the Olympics were in Atlanta, Georgia, and they actually used a firm out of Philly, and that was the first legal battle. And so, to your point, like the players that didn't have, that were maybe on the bottom of the roster, they were not the ones that took the hit. It was the top players. And then, so that was 96. Fast forward to 2019, I'm not good at math, I'm a lawyer. What is it, 23 years? Over 20 years is when you had the second moment, which was leading up to the World Cup. And that was an employment lawyer and a soccer fan's dream, right? Because that 2019 World Cup, and I would argue the World Cup for the Lionesses right now is exhibit A to their cause of action, to their performance is going to give them leverage to the next step in their organizing efforts. And so that's what was so incredible, among other things, about the 2019 World Cup is like that that's why they won 13-0. Every game, every performance was showing, because in the US, equal pay means that you are getting paid an equal amount for doing a similar or substantially similar job. So they were saying, we're getting paid less and we're doing the job and we're doing it better. And I'm not just saying that to be a soccer fan. That actually was like, they were fulfilling an element of their case in the 2019 World Cup. So I think the beautiful thing about what the U.S. team did and what the Lionesses are doing is it's spreading around. And it's just interesting because in the U.S. we have this history of unions and history of employment law, like anti-retaliation. And the fact that these women played that World Cup was a textbook on how you cannot retaliate against these women. If they say something, it's all discoverable. If they say something after a game, before a game, that's all discoverable in their lawsuit. So that was just a genius move on their part. And I hope, and I'm interested to see how it plays out with the Lionesses.
I think this conversation too is interesting that we can actually take it across the UK and US border and talk about that in the World Cup now. You have a lot of teams that are not exactly on the same wavelength as their federations and a lot of teams that are being very successful and have done exactly kind of, Daniel, what you mentioned and Susie, just okay. And so I also think I just want to give a shout out to women in general, especially the women that are playing in this tournament that aren't necessarily doing some of the things that their counterparts have done in other men's World Cups when they've chosen not to get off the bus to train or not to do certain things because they were mad at the federation or not get on airplanes because their checks didn't come in on time. And a lot of these women who, with the recent numbers we've seen, FIFA came out and said the average salary for a female player is $14,000 a year. We know that that's not what's happening in the US or not probably what's happening even at the WSL level. But overall, there's probably quite a few players that are even playing in this tournament that don't get paid at all to play. And the performance that they're putting on the field for me is just so impressive and that they're still going. And Nigeria yesterday,
I know,
was amazing. And they're having a huge problem. Jamaica has played amazing and they're having a huge problem. And I think I just trying to give a shout out to all the women that are like, okay, we can put this to the side and we can go out and we can compete. And this is what women's football is showing the world. So I'll get off my soapbox and we can jump into a different topic.
Well, I'd like to pick on something that Daniel mentioned a little while back. You mentioned communication. Communication is needed on the women's side. And Arianna, you and I have talked about this, about communication, not only with among clubs, among the administration level, but also among the player level. And we've talked about in the US, there is the principle of pay transparency. And for non-supervisory employees, this is all labor law. Labor law is a union law. That's what we call it over here. Players, it's protected right for them to talk about their compensation with each other. And so, Arianna, I'm going to kick it to you. How do you think that could benefit over in the UK and Europe and also here in the US? What's the culture of a locker room as it relates to compensation?
So I would say while we have this idea of transparency in the States and knowing our rights, I can guarantee you a lot of American players or international players playing in the WSL do not go in the locker room and share what they're getting from the club, from the employer, or from their sponsorships. Those are conversations that most women feel very uncomfortable having. And because we don't have the data and it's not public, it's even more complicated. And so not just from my experience, but on a different note, I've started a startup and I've started to do market research that a lot of women aren't talking about salary for various reasons. And in Europe, and me trying to talk to players even years ago, because I always thought it was really interesting and that we should be talking about it because it gives the employers too much power and it gives the agents who we think might know what they're doing, and some of them do, but not all of them know what's actually going on in the market. They're also kind of guessing, since we don't know these numbers and there's nothing out there to really see it. Why aren't we talking about it? Why are players so scared to discuss this? And why do you think another player is going to judge you? And some of them will say yes with their closer friends on the team. They'll talk about it, but they don't want to be judged or animosity, or they don't want to feel like they're being underpaid and they're stupid for signing that contract and they could do so much better. And there's a lot of different reasons that go into it from a lot of different sides. But I think it's so important for these conversations to start happening. And you don't have to give your exact salary, but at least a range would be so much better, and it will help players. Or some players have a lot of bonuses or add-ons that other players didn't even know was possible to write into their contracts, that just wasn't feasible for them. Or adding a language class because you're living in a new country, something very minimal that some clubs do automatically, but some players, they just have to ask for it because the club already has this person, but they're not going to put it out there if the player doesn't request. So there's a lot of little things that can go in and be really helpful. And again, I think this goes back to the professionalization of the game means the players have to take more responsibility and understand what can go in their contracts, and to understand it, they have to start asking questions, and they have to start working with each other and doing their own research.
Well, I'm just gonna throw something in, if that's all right, which is, the interesting thing about the MLS, for example, is everybody knows what everyone's earning. I would have assumed that on the NWSL side that sort of same transparency approach would have at some point filtered in the same way that, for example, on the European and UK side, nobody knows anything.
That's
is
so
the truth.
funny. That's okay. So I don't know anything about the NWSL. All I know is the collective bargaining agreement is on the internet, and you can see the salaries. I don't know about the NWSL. Arianna, you were nodding. You kind of probably have player connections.
I know that the players that I know and I've spoken to have said that they don't talk about it and they don't share. And so I think when you talk about the CBA, you know what the minimum is, but you don't know like every range and even how to range. And I think it becomes so much more complicated in sport because players can sign, and they can sign massive contracts, and then they get injured, and then somebody takes their spot. So I could be coming off the bench and considered a bench player, and Daniela got injured, and but she makes 5 times more than me, but now I'm totally dominating, so she's not going to get her spot back. But now if I know, like, I'm going to be upset that she's still making more money than me, and I know that she makes more money than me, but I don't know how much more money than me she's actually making. And so, can I call my agent and go back to the table and be like, well, I'm your starting goalkeeper and we've just gone up 6 positions in the league, and my goals against average is 0.2, whatever these look like what can you do? And I think that's the difference though too, in not all sectors, but for example, Susie, and correct me if I'm wrong, you also know that how much people are making is because of the billable hours that they're doing, so that they're putting in the work. And again, in sport, you can have players who are starters or score lots of goals, and you think they're the laziest player in the whole world, and you have to go out and you have to run so much harder, and you have to do so much more work, and you're in the locker room
standing there,
and they're being, money is just being thrown at them because of their skill at scoring a goal. And so I think it gets really, really complicated when it comes to sport. And it also comes down to coaching, like the head coach. It's a very subjective decision on who plays and who doesn't. And so I've known in the past some players who make a lot of money, and the club is like, why isn't this player playing? We're paying her a lot of money just to be sitting there, and coaches, she's not putting in the work or this or that. And so it is really complicated.
It's so complicated. That's why this is like an employment lawyer's dream. The fact patterns, Daniel, are just so great.
It's totally right. And Arianna, you brought up a really good point around, I actually think the WSL clubs now, the complexity of their employment contracts outside of the standard template that's almost sort of quasi-collectively bargained, is now becoming more complex. Whereas, you would just have, the player's going to have a basic amount of this, and she's going to have these type of benefits or whatever. Now, it is very much now moving towards what the types of incentives that the male team and the male players are going on, which is less individual incentives, like, you know, how many clean sheets, how many assists, how many goals, into how do you contribute? Did you start? Did you appear? Did you win the game? How many games have you played in the season in order to contribute to a winning season? Did you qualify for the UCL? Did you even win the league? Did you win a cup, for example, as part of the collective? And whereas in the past it felt like it was a little bit more individualized, the approach on the EPL side that I've seen is always now the collective, really, and that is now, I think, the line of travel into the WSL too, actually.
And I think, I mean, I don't know if we really want to go into this. Like, if we start talking about maternity rights, that if you choose to have a baby, you might get more rights from the club, whether, you know, if they're sending a babysitter with you and all the financial benefits that come in, because having a child is very expensive, childcare is very expensive. So if the club is covering childcare for certain players, do other players have a right to ask to get that money on the side as a benefit if they choose not to have children?
I can talk about that on the US side. So as it relates to like an executive agreement or player contract, as you all would say, you can contract whatever you want. So if you say, I have 2 kids, I want my children on the road with me, I want a nanny with me, and I have golden boots, so you better, like, I want the top shelf. You can contract for whatever you want. Now, the issue that I'm hearing from you, Arianna, that I hear from a lot of executives of changing companies have the same insecurities as players, different circumstances, but the same insecurities. Like, if I ask for this, the deal's going to go away. So it does take a good agent. It does take a collective culture of asking for things or demanding them, or just telling them what you need. But anyway, so on the in drafting and negotiating a contract, you can ask for whatever you want. Now, let's take the rank and file employee or the player that doesn't have that baller, doesn't have Daniel and an agent negotiating some killer contract. The law only requires you to accommodate somebody for like, if you need to bond with a child, we have the Family Medical Leave Act here. That is something that's leave, and you can also accommodate it. So a club can choose to accommodate an employee, but you have to do it across the board. Now that's outside of the player contract. So rank and file employees, or those that don't have a player contract, need to be aware of, if there needs to be an accommodation under a federal law, that could apply for an accommodation.
Yeah, well, I think the interesting thing is, so we talked about this in prep a few weeks ago, but I'll just put this on here, which is, this is raising the bar. So this is the report.
We can't see it. It's all fuzzy. You have to put it like directly over your face.
Yeah,
you have to put it over your face. No, you still can't see it.
It's because he's in the call center.
So this is the Karen Carney report into women's football in the UK, and there's actually some really interesting insights on maternity pay. So for the 22-23 season, a player going on maternity leave will be paid for their full weekly wage for the first 14 weeks, which is surprisingly quite an uplift from previous. But they also made reference to the fact that in rugby, the English women's rugby team is actually leading the approach in terms of maternity pay, because they give 26 weeks of full maternity pay, and then when returning from maternity leave, they're also allowed to take a relevant support person to take care of their children on match day. And the other really interesting thing that I was reading as well today, actually, was that if they are to your point, Arianna, around shorter term contracts, if they are pregnant or returning from maternity leave during a period by which they were going to be renegotiating their contract going into the last 12 months, there is an automatic 12-month extension to that contract as a result, which would be unheard of at the moment in the WSL. But is raising the bar, at least from the rugby side, which I found fascinating, really, and something that probably shouldn't be fascinating, and should be relatively standard, but it seems like, you know, different leagues are doing things at different speeds and levels.
Well, I can tell you the NWSL CBA for pregnancy leave says, like, a player who cannot render services required as a result of the pregnancy, they receive 100% of the base pay, that they would receive under the player agreement, just they have it, and there's no time limit to that. And then for parental leave, they get 8 weeks paid leave. So as my question, you do international transfers, Daniel, and Arianna, you have connections to the States. Do you think players are looking at these policies and thinking, okay, I'd like to have kids someday. Maybe I should go play in the US, or maybe I should stay here. Do you think that even enters a player's mind?
I mean, no. I think at this point, these regulations are so new that I think players are just happy to understand that they're there and that it's not a fallback. But I also think a lot of players are not necessarily planning parenthood during the height of their career for numerous reasons right now. And because of these new regulations, maybe the next generation or in a few years we'll see more, because maybe you could plan it better, or you could even talk to the club and like share more about what's happening with your body. I would say that most women aren't like, oh, cool, I'm like hitting 27. I do want to have kids, but I want to play football.
Easy on 27.
Okay, I'm older than you, so it's fine. And for those that don't know, I'm actually pregnant now, and I did it post-career, and then it hasn't been the easiest thing ever. And, there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, so I think I get to say what I want to say on this one. But I think there's an age where you might start to think about it, and so you're like, okay, I'm going to make options for a playing career that you could get to go and sign with a huge club and have a baby at the same time, because you're not at, quote unquote, the height of your career and your level of play. So I think it'd be great if that does come in. What I think is more interesting from wanting to become a mother or thinking about becoming a mother, and I haven't seen this in Europe yet, and this could also be because in Europe and country to country here in Europe, you have different regulations on the help that the state gives you for IVF. But I've really liked seeing that some of the clubs in the States have brought in sponsors that are IVF clinics and giving the players the opportunity to freeze their eggs and to learn about it much younger, not at the point where you're thinking about this happening, but
like when you're so old, like 28.
You know what? Calm yourself. I'm over a decade more than that. So no, I think honestly, having that conversation right out of university, or maybe not the 18-year-olds, but 22-year-olds, maybe people don't want to know, but the older you get, the less eggs you have, the harder it is, more opportunities. In the States, we're using IVF more and more and more and more, even for women who aren't playing sports for whatever reason in our environment. Getting pregnant is much, much harder for our population and the generations following us. And so these conversations for women knowing, okay, I can play for a very long time and I won't stop my career, and then I will have the opportunity to still become a mother is just so cool to me and so fantastic. And having an outlet and doctors to talk to you and what that does and when in your cycle or when in the season you could do this and what that looks like is just super cool. And also, if they're sponsoring, it means they're opening these conversations. So not just for players, but for women who want to become badass lawyers but want to become mothers, and they still want to go through and get their name on the door before that happens, because we know in society, if you tell them you want to have a baby, or if you get pregnant for a multitude of reasons, like your career can go on a standstill. And so I think this recognition is awesome. And I'd love to see it more in Europe, even though it wouldn't come from a sponsorship, but, can clubs share with players the opportunity that they have? And this crosses over even, it means players who are same-sex marriages can have this, like there's a whole lot that can go into that, but I think it's fantastic that this is coming to the forefront and that the conversations are happening. And that, I mean, I wish I would have known this. I really do. I wish I would have known this 20 years ago. It was different, but it was not easy for me. And I know a lot of other players that have been in similar situations.
Yeah, I love hearing your perspective on this, Arianna. And I think back to looking at the player as a whole beyond the salaries, right? So the benefits that these clubs, and I know you're probably sick of hearing me say that, like all of my non-sports clients, right? The clients in the quote real world, we'll say, outside of sport, are talking about ways to compensate their employees, and it includes benefits like the IVF stuff. I mean, the San Diego Waves just did a partnership with Trust and Will, which is for estate planning, like thinking about the future, So I think like that, looking at the player beyond that base salary and providing the benefits and seeing them as a whole is huge. And I can't speak to the men's game because I don't have any experience in it, Daniel, but it's benefits like this that I think is different in on the women's side, because we have to think about this. Women give birth. We've known this. And to your point, the IVF thing, there are a lot of there's same-sex employees everywhere, but it throws a nod to everybody on the team. And I think we're going to see more of that. What benefits can we give these players for their time beyond the sport and also while they're playing? They are giving their bodies to the sport. And it is completely different, but I see it every day in law. Women wait to have kids, and also women get pregnant unexpectedly. So this happens, and so we have to be prepared. And it seems like the CBA is doing their best to prepare for all scenarios.
So I have to tell you guys, my daughter's kicking like crazy right now because I think she's getting excited that things are changing for women in general. But besides that, on a different note, actually, I would counter too on you, Susie, on this one though, that the CBA actually that US Soccer for the women signed has actually positively affected the dads on the men's side, because some of them have actually put into place, or I don't know the great law jargon that you're supposed to use, or
well, I can do this. So you and I got into it about parental leave. Here, we really don't.
But it's not. Sorry, it's not the parental leave part. The guys have activated that they want to take their kids under a certain age on the road with them when they go to national events, because if the women do it, then the men get the CBA, and that's amazing. Like that is so. They're like, no, it is time that I want to bond with my child too. I have the right to do this in the CBA, and so the men are actually profiting in a good way from this CBA that the women created because of the parental leave. And I just think that's also awesome that it's not so one-sided. It's not like, okay, the CBA came out and it's only benefiting the women's players, but it truly is benefiting the men's players too. And so it would be very cool to see this. I'd love to see some EPL guys traveling on the road with like their 3 kids and see what that looks like.
But that's why the women's side, like we can take what we want from the men's side, but we really have to create what works for the women. And so I think that, and then, the men will take what they want. But to the point about leave, in the US, in Pennsylvania, where I am right now, you can't have a parental leave policy that just benefits women because they give birth, right? In Pennsylvania, like it has to be to everybody. That's why when we were talking about parental leave, it's such in this where I am, my clients cannot say, all right, Arianna can get 12 weeks to bond with the child, but Daniel can only get 5 weeks to bond with the child. That's discriminating against Daniel. So we just say parental leave. And so that's why, like in the US here, like whatever a club gives to a female, it has to give to a male. And then it also takes into account same-sex couples, 2 men having a child, 2 women having a child, etc. So that's really fun. I have a hard stop at 9:15.
So I have a question though, really quick. Daniel, have you seen any men put any sort of child care or child anything in the benefits of their contracts? Have you ever come across something really unique that you're like, wow, that's pretty progressive or pretty cool that they're doing that?
That's such a good question.
I haven't, but I'm now going to do it because you told me to do, Arianna.
Yeah,
I mean, I just like, come on, how cool would that be? Or something like club has to guarantee.
Yes, but at the same time, Arianna, like the thing is that you have the same issue. Maybe they'll have more power on the men's side in a way, but the men still have the same issue of, I don't want to do anything to rock the boat that might actually impact on the sporting side of things. And but at the same time, I'm positive almost all of my clients don't know that they don't know that might be something that they could do.
Daniel, see what good is coming from this conversation?
I love it. Really good. Now, if I just say one thing really quickly, just simply because I'm so unqualified to speak on all of this, and that's why it's been fascinating just to hear on the particular point on, effectively having to make a binary decision. You either, on the whole, play, or you have a baby. We were speaking beforehand about this in prep, and I was at a conference where 2 players were talking about how it never entered their minds to even think about starting a family because this is what they've been working towards since they were 13 years old or 14 years old. So why jeopardize or even have the potential to jeopardize this type of thing? that to me is the socialization thing that will change, won't it, in due course, is that when the protections are there and when CBAs get better and things work incrementally, that 13-year-old or 14-year-old girl isn't thinking I have to make the binary choice anymore, because she can then do both, or at least get towards that stage.
And it goes so much farther than that, though, because it also means that the medical research behind it, so that the trainers actually know how to help women return to play from pregnancy. It's not return to play from ACL surgery. It's not return to play from another sort of injury. And while in theory you could argue that your body was injured or had a traumatic thing in a positive way happen to it, it's a completely different type of return to play. And how can you return, or how long can you train with the team, or how can you be training throughout your pregnancy? I go to the gym and I get the dirtiest looks, and women regularly think they can come and tell me that I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing in the gym. Like whatever they say now, okay, thank you, I'll stop and directly go home and get in bed. But no, I've talked to my doctor.
What do they say when you're at the bar drinking and smoking?
I mean, to be honest, I haven't done that in so long. You've been pretty baby, but like, obviously women can do what they want with their body, and so this is a unique argument. But I also think it's just going to change the way we think about, even now, talking about periods, like period. We can say that, and that's not going to get bleeped out, and people aren't going to stop listening to this podcast because I just said that, because it's becoming front of mind, and we're talking about it in this World Cup with ACL injuries, and how is that possibly related to our periods, or how our bodies. And the second thing that I think is really interesting, and I don't have a medical background, is that I've actually heard a lot of players say that they came back physically stronger from having a baby because of the hormones and the different things that your body goes to. Or some women who actually had been injured, and it just happened that they had had a huge injury kind of at a similar time period when they found out they were pregnant, and that they say that they probably would have never been able to come back at the highest level had they not been pregnant, because what your body was able to create and do during that time actually healed some of those injuries that you had or were lasting. And so I think once we get more research too, it's really going to change the game of talking about pregnancy and what that looks like, and when in the season can you get pregnant, and how you can come back. And that all goes into the professionalization to have the right medical staff around you who knows what they're doing and have been properly trained in it. There's a lot of people that
properly trained
to do some good stuff, but the research also isn't out there for them to know. So there's still a ways that we can go, but I think we're going in the right direction, and I think it might inevitably trickle out and help a lot more women outside of sport too.
And I also think it's about, I can only speak on like the management side, but Daniel, what you're saying, it can be actually a career for somebody, and it's about like employee retention. If we're really thinking about it, if you have these policies in place, Arianna, to your awesome point about if you have these professionals, medical staff that understand the player and the medical side of things, then you can retain that employee, and they can continue to perform and make money for the club and the team and themselves. And there are so many different facets to a soccer player, a football player. But it's the same thing on, again, like in the quote real world, where how do we maintain this lawyer who had twins? How can we make sure she comes back? How can we make, we're gonna allow her to work remotely. We're going to have a nanny for her because she's going on trial, so it's all about retaining the talent. And so it's not just we're trying to be altruistic and make sure these pregnant players get care. It really affects the bottom line, and it's good business to provide care to these players and to provide sophisticated professionals and have them around to advise the club and the team and the players. So it all comes down to, if you want to have a successful club that makes money, you have to take care of this player. Because why are you going to have like Arianna, you're like a killer goalie, but you have a child and you're done, or you have these star players. If they want to leave, let them leave. But if they want to stay, we got to give them a platform, because bottom line is they're going to make us money. They're going to promote the club, the team, and the league.
And I think it will cross over though too in the women working at the clubs who may work on the women's side of the club or on the men's side of the club, retaining that employees who know what they're doing and are top, and giving them that pathway to continue. A lot of research has come out, at the board level of the Men's Premier League, that it's 11.1%, if I'm not mistaken. But now they're doing a lot of research saying the more diverse the board is, the better that represents the community and the more money the club will make. So besides the
that's a whole other podcast.
The whole, like, the morality, the positive good, all of these great things that we can put, like, make it really nice. At the end of the day, it's all business. And the bottom line is helping women understand their bodies and what they want and can do, and returning to work, whether that's on the pitch or in the boardroom, is good business for the clubs. And as soon as we can get that out there and they see these finances coming back, we will get the research that we need, I think.